Hey, so you want to know about the three different types of magic that were common in Norse practices? Great topic. There are three main ones that we know about: Seiðr, Galdr, and Runic magic. So let's break them down. Seiðr, it could be pronounced Seiðr or Seiðr, depending on pronunciations. We're not really too sure about how Old Norse was pronounced, but from our best reckoning, it's Seiðr or Seiðr. Anyways, this was some serious magic. We're talking about seeing the future, messing with fate, and maybe even cursing your enemies. Who knows? That kind of thing. Here's what's really interesting about Seiðr. It was mostly women's magic, like almost exclusively, primarily practiced by women, called vulvas or seers. Men could do it too, but they really got a lot of side eye from society. There was this whole concept of ergi, which basically meant unmanliness or being a sissy. And practicing Seiðr as a guy could get you labeled as that. Why the stigma? It just wasn't random sexism. It really connected to how the Norse viewed fate and power. Seiðr involved going into trance states, being receptive, being passive in a way, and receiving this information, which was seen as a feminine thing. And that clashed with the whole active warrior ideal that men typically were expected to embody in that context. So you may ask, how did it actually work? From what we know, a vulva would sit on this raised platform or like the high seat in a hall or house, wearing usually some special clothing, holding a staff. There's a great description in the Saga of Eric the Red where they talk about this whole ritual. I recommend you read it. But basically, she'd have people singing these songs to help her go into this trance state. Then she'd answer questions about the future, predict the weather for farmers, that sort of thing. The goddess Freya was said to have taught Seiðr to mankind and even other gods. Hey, Odin. Which tells you how powerful that it was actually considered that even Odin wanted to learn Seiðr magic. And if you call him Ergi, you might get punched in the mouth. Now, Galdr, or chanting magic, is different. The word comes from gala, which means to crow or to chant. This is magic through sound, through speaking or singing specific words and or formulas of words. Whereas Seiðr was more being receptive and being passive, this was a very active magical form. And get this, men could practice Galdr without the social problems. Again, this was seen as more of an active, more about skill and knowledge type of magic and not the trance, receptive, and speaking out. Odin himself practiced Galdr. In the Havamal, toward the end, he talks about learning 18 different charms that go in there. I know a charm that does this. I know a charm that does that. I know one that does this. That's Galdr. And the way you said these words mattered just as much as what you were saying. The rhythm, the tone, the repetition. You couldn't just read it off like you're ordering coffee and the delivery was part of the magic. You couldn't just do that. You had to chant it, usually like in some kind of a poetic way. Again, the delivery was the magic of Galdr. People use Galdr for all kinds of things. They used it for healing, protection in battle, the outcome of battle, maybe calming a storm, winning someone's affection, cursing your enemies, breaking other curses. It was pretty versatile stuff. It was like the type of magic. It went a long way. Sometimes Galdr was even carved and not just spoken. And I'll get into this in a little bit, but a lot of these magical forms do have some overlap with them as well. For example, like Galdr being carved and not just spoken, they would carve runes on a weapon or an amulet, and then you would chant to them to wake them up or to activate them. So the sound brought the magic and brought the runes and the words to life. So you carve the runes and then you use the chanting magic to waken them up. So it was like a twofold thing. The third type of magic we have is runic magic. It's really just carved symbols, carved letters, for lack of a better term. So the runes were the letters of the early Germanic alphabet, right? So it's like they had letters of these different runes, and they had a name and a meaning assigned to it. I mean, each rune had a sound, just like each letter has its own sound, but they had deeper symbolic meanings as well. And remember, not everyone who could write runes did magic with them. Just because it was a letter and it was words that they could write down doesn't mean that it was always magic. But there were skilled rune masters. They understood the deeper meanings of the runes, and they could combine runes for specific magical effects. It could be just as simple as carving victory on a sword and chanting to it, and that meant victory in battle. Or it could have been, like, as we know of, like, modern bind runes, is a possibility that it was used like that as well. We don't know, so don't crucify me in the comments. And even there's a warning in the Havamal about the way you write these down. It basically says don't carve runes for magic unless you actually know how to read them and read them properly. Because apparently you can mess things up if you did it wrong. So just keep that in mind. Don't pretend you know. Don't just assume you know. Really put some thought, put some study, put some meditation into these runes, and talk to multiple sources, read multiple books, just to make sure you truly understand the meanings of these runes before you start writing them down. So you may ask, what did people do with the rune magic? They carved runes on weapons for victory, as I said. They put them on amulets for protection, even carved insults and curses to shame their enemies. Magical trash talk was a thing. And ancient graffiti was a thing. There's like literally stuff carved out. Bob was here. But remember, the act of carving the rune itself had some power. We find some archaeological evidence of this all over the place. Weapons with runes on them, jewelry with runes on them, that don't necessarily make sense outside of a magical context. All kinds of objects had these runes tied into them, or carved into them, rather. People often use runes for divination. There's a Roman historian, Tacitus, writing about 100 CE, somewhere back then, maybe in the 90s. And he describes Germanic people casting marked wooden pieces and reading the patterns. This could be just like the modern idea of throwing runes on a cloth and reading what those runes meant. We don't know 100%, but later sources even talk about casting runes and interpreting them to get insight into various situations. And as I alluded to before, these three types weren't completely separate forms of magic. They weren't just separate and didn't overlap. There was quite a bit of overlap. A skilled practitioner would combine these things. Like I mentioned before, you can carve runes and then use Galdr chanting to activate that rune. A Volva might use runes in her cloak and on her staff. She might use trance work with spoken charms in the same ritual context. So there was some overlap between these different forms of magic, but we've separated them out for better understanding and for better classification and just overall studying these different magical things so we can learn one and then branch out into the others. There's a text called the Seiðr Fumal. If I mispronounced it, roast me in the comments. Basically, a Valkyrie was teaching a hero about the runes. She was even explaining which runes to use for what purposes and how to activate them properly. So, the knowledge of the runes, the words to speak the runes, and the ritual context, it really all worked together. There were a lot of overlap, like I was saying. So before we get into some more of the modern stuff, I just want to be real with you and just bring it down to the basics. Our sources on ancient Norse magics are fragmented. Most of what we know comes from the Eddas and the Icelandic sagas that were written down in the 13th century by Christians. They were recording earlier pagan practices, but they likely missed a lot of detail, and through their own lens, they may have decided to exclude a lot of the magical practices just because they didn't want to teach that, just, again, for their own biases and their own personal missions. And because of that, we don't have some unbroken tradition with like literally instruction manuals setting these out so we can learn these things in detail. We just have bits and pieces. We have descriptions in some writings, warnings in others, fragments of charms. That's really it. But that being said, and I want to really make sure that this point goes home. You have a lot of people in the Reconstructionist mindset that looks at the sources and that says, hey, we don't know these things, so anybody who practices these forms of magic are liars, frauds, charlatans, whatever. And I just want to say that just because a lot of these magical practices were lost to history doesn't mean they can't be found again. Ancient people learned these things. They found these magics. They found these practices. And it doesn't mean they can't be found again. And I want to just really make sure people understand that. And to have that connection. That just because it wasn't written in detail doesn't mean it can't be relearned. Through study, through meditation, through spiritual connection and spiritual work, these things can come back. And again, just because it wasn't detailed step by step in these ancient documents doesn't mean it can't be relearned. So, again, getting off my soapbox there, that's a pet peeve of mine. Moving on, what about today? Modern practitioners are reconstructing these practices based on those sources. And I want to be clear again, this involves a lot of interpretation and educated guesswork. We have to just figure this out. We're learning these things all over again, generally without a teacher, so it takes time, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of personal interpretation and a personal spiritual work. So Seiðr today looks different in different groups because of this. Some people do trance work and journeying, and some focus on divination. That's not a problem. Many groups welcome practitioners of all genders. So you'll have male and female vulvas, though some traditional Reconstructionists will stick to the historical gender stuff where females will practice Seiðr and men will go Galdr, rune magic, etc. People might say in some of these practices sit in a Seiðr chair while others provide drumming and singing, trying to recreate what the sagas described. But again, we're working from incomplete information, so we're building this as we go. Galdr in modern practice often means chanting rune names, creating charms based on historical examples, or composing new ones in the same style. The big challenge for this, we don't know exactly how Old Norse sounded, as I said. So when we talk about Galdr being the sounds and how the words were said was the magic, reconstructing this with Old Norse is going to be difficult because, again, we don't know how Old Norse sounded. So different groups may make different choices about the pronunciation and even the rhythm of these chants. Scholars like Jackson Crawford and others are working diligently to uncover the specifics about Old Norse, but again, we're reconstructing these things as we go. Runic magic is probably the most popular of all the three in modern pagan practice. People cast runes for divination often. They carve them on objects. They use bind runes as magical symbols, meditate on individual runes for personal growth, and other things. Me personally, I love the runes because of that interpretation. I've even put together a notebook on the runes so people can learn and build their own understanding based on these runes so that they will understand a little bit more getting into it rather than learning bits and pieces from different people or really pulling out bad information. So I put the basics in there, what we know, and then allow people to build on that from how they personally want to go about that. And like I said, a lot of interpretations aren't historical. Some are like they deviate from the historical. Like I mentioned a couple of times already, this is all up for interpretation, and we don't 100% know the specifics of this. There's some books out there on it. Some are great, some are bad. Some add some really weird New Age stuff to it. Runic yoga, anyone. Reconstructionists can get pretty heated about that. Again, attack me in the comments if you want. Doesn't bother me. The bottom line is that different modern groups handle this differently. Some are very dogmatic, some are very loosey-goosey. It just depends on the individual groups. Some stick really close to what the tiny bit of historical evidence we have and don't deviate from that at all. Others use the historical framework as really a jumping off point and then just innovate from there and use your own interpretation and build on these practices. That's how they were done in the past. That's how we can do them today. Just be respectful to it. Don't go changing a bunch of crap. And know that no approach is inherently wrong. They're just different ways of connecting with this tradition, as long as it's done respectfully. The important thing is really being honest about what's historical and what is modern interpretation. The Norse practice these forms of magic in ways that we can only understand a tiny amount today. Modern practitioners are doing their best to honor these traditions while creating new, meaningful spiritual practices for themselves. So that's the 3 types of Norse magic. Pretty cool, right? It's really a good place to start and a place for understanding to happen with these different types of magic. If you want to get into discussion, put your comments, questions down in the comments below this video. Jump over to thepagantemple.com and hit the little login or new here button and join our Discord community where we can have these conversations and we can go beyond this stuff. And again, even my room book, there's a PDF available in our Discord community. I create these books, sell them on Amazon to fund the Pagan Temple, but at the same time, within the community, the PDFs for these are freely available. I don't believe in gatekeeping information, so come over even if it's just for that. If I didn't mention before, my name is Matt Holloway. I am the founder of the Pagan Temple. We have some good people over there. It's a small community and growing where these conversations happen. Our foundational messages, just education builds understanding, and understanding builds acceptance. So if we can educate people, pagans and non-pagans, about what we do, at least they can understand what we are. And so maybe we can gain a little bit more acceptance in society for what we are and who we are and what we do. That's the mission, the goal for the Pagan Temple. Just educational resources. Check it out. Look at the blog. At the top, there's a getting started link where if you don't know much about paganism, you want to jump into it. This is the first time hearing about it. There's some links in there. You can read through it. Working on different lessons for different specific things. And I'll plan on putting lessons specifically for Seiðr, Galdr, Runic, magic, and more. Yeah. I'll see you in the next one.